Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, cybersecurity vulnerabilities have been plaguing supply chains across multiple industries. In fact, according to an analysis conducted by BSI, ransomware attacks on the supply chain have increased by 66% in the last 3 years, expediting the concern of cybersecurity for private companies. Now, considering these attacks range from targeting the sea modality to the trucking modality, and tools to combat the threat of cyber attacks on the supply chain have solidified in the last year, it's making it a central part of the cybersecurity policy over in the US. But over here in the UK, Mark Brown, Global Managing Director of Digital Trust Consulting Services at BSI, he's going to join me in conversation about all this, along with exploring cybersecurity risks and the trends that he's seeing emerging, and how we can better prepare, and why there is also a lot to be hopeful for. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the UK, where you can join me and Mark Brown in conversation about all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Hi everyone, my name is Mark Brown and I'm the Global Managing Director for Digital Trust Consulting Services at BSI, the British Standards Institution. My role is to lead the global team to develop new solutions for our clients and to really leverage the 30 years of experience I have across the technology, risk and technology leadership spectrum, working both in national, international and truly global roles to really help our clients move past the challenges that they're seeing every day as digital becomes so systemic to the success of our society.
Excellent. And before we dive a little bit deeper into BSI and the work that you're doing there, you did mention you've got 30 years experience in the business. So I always like to take my guests back in time, though, and learn more about how you got here. Ultimately, what is your origin story? Where did your passion for tech come from and what lit the spark? Is there a story there?
Yeah, no, there's a few stories actually, and it's I always like to get to know people as well. My career has been a long and varied one, and 30 years sounds an awful long time, but it's had a number of specific chapters to it. But I can trace it all back largely to my father. I still look up to him as a true father figure. He worked for the same company all his life after leaving school. Didn't go to university. Graduated as a modern apprentice, and he learnt the tools of the trade with electrics and electronic engineering. After leaving school, and that was a bit of became a bit of a hobby for me to sort of see what he was doing. And if you look back to the sort of mid-1980s, I always remember the fanfare at the local school when we were able to buy our first computer for the school, a BBC Apple Micro of all things. And I still remember programming in Pascal on it to this day, although I probably couldn't do it as effectively now. That really caught the bug for me. My dad was into electronics and everything around engineering. I caught the bug, and going through school, focused on mathematics, physics, science, all traditional STEM subjects. Demonstrated a flair for those, and it became a career rather than just a hobby. I put it to different uses, however, because the first 15 years of my career was actually spent in the services. I joined the British Army in the early 90s. I was fortunate enough to travel the world through the first few years. And then from probably the last 5 or 6 years, I describe it at best as traveling most of the holiday hotspots of the world apart from Iraq. So Afghanistan multiple times, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, all the places that most people wouldn't put on their holiday destination list. But I was able to put to my experience within computing and technology to good use, because my role within the army was in this field of intelligence and counterintelligence and security, and being able to demonstrate the need for that when your forces are traveling to these far-flung environments is critical. In 2005, we got to a point where I was seeing stuff happen that was becoming a bit too close for comfort. And I'd done my time for Queen and Country, as it were, then, and decided that in my sort of early to mid 30s, it was now time to look at a second career, or to really move into the second part of my career. And having left the army, I then decided I wanted to really focus in on cybersecurity. Who'd have known back in 2005 it would be as pivotal a decision to my career as it has been now? Because back in the mid 2000s, it was very much seen as a bit of a compliance topic. It wasn't seen as a true business enabler. It was still seen as maybe a dark art. 15 years later, we see that it has truly moved on. And during those 15 plus years in private sector, I've always balanced my roles between a role in industry and a role in professional services. Helping clients, but also keeping the skills honed. I've moved through some of the biggest companies in the world. So I spent a tenure at the start of the 2010s as the Global CISO at SABMiller. I then, after was headhunted across from SABMiller to be a partner at EY, and led their UK and Ireland cybersecurity, data privacy, and business resilience practice for three and a half years. And then my main client said, well, you've kept telling us what we're doing badly at IT, so why don't you come and run it for us? So I spent 2 years as their global CIO and CTO, running a digital transformation, an IoT transformation, and a manufacturing transformation. And you're very much earning the battle scars, and a second series of battle scars and a bloodstained T-shirt of real practical experience in what is still very much a niche environment for many organizations today. That got me into the wonderful world of Industry 4.0. And, before joining BSI, I spent 2 years at Wipro working with the Indian outsource community, really looking at the whole world of Industry 4.0 and how that was going to evolve, and helping clients really embrace that challenge. If you look back at the end of 2020, pandemic was in full flight. Wasn't really the time to be looking for a new role, but a new role came and found me, and the opportunity to really move to BSI, having been that Fortune 10 Global CISO, Fortune 500 CIO, CTO, Big Four partner, big global SI partner. I was looking, if it was going to be another role, it had to be something which had an element of paying it back and paying it forward to the next generation. And if you consider the history behind BSI, where back in 1995, we wrote the original standard for information security, who better to go and work for and to run the business unit of the people who actually wrote the theory book in this topic? And for me, it's been a highly successful transition, just over a year now with BSI, and loving the fact that, able to help customers and deliver that stewardship at an industry level to really say, what is cybersecurity of the future? What should we societally be doing? And how can I pay back the benefits of the 3 decades of experience that I've been given by others through my career to the next generation of cybersecurity professionals?
Wow, what a great backstory. I just love the fact that it began with a BBC computer, because I think it was the BBC B with the red keys along the top, and I still get flashbacks of copying code from magazines and correcting syntax errors afterwards for hours. But so much was going on at that time. It was incredibly exciting, wasn't it, for saying how simple those machines were?
They were simple, but I think people didn't realize, and we take technology, the pace of technology change we take for granted now.
Yeah.
I think we probably didn't realize it at the time just how quickly technology advancements were moving on. Our kids treat it as second nature. We probably overlooked it completely because for most people, not everybody had everything at their fingertips. And therefore, whilst if you were lucky enough to have access to it, then you treated it with, it was kept pristine. And, the pace of change when we look back was enormous in many of the activities.
It really was. And of course, here in 2022, and as we record this podcast, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world at the moment, and possibly cyber attacks, etc., can continue to increase. And more recently, they've increased against the supply chain of rocketed, especially in the last year, with some figures indicating something like 66% increase over the last 3 years. But can you set the scene and expand on the range of attacks that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing is that if we look back in history at traditional approaches to cybersecurity within organizations, I would simplify it as describing it that organizations sought to deploy the walls of Jericho around their environment. They were in absolute control. The firewall perimeter was their domain, and anything inside that they had knowledge of what was ongoing. But modern technological computing has changed significantly, and probably a seminal moment for many organizations, if they didn't already consider that those walls of Jericho have been truly broken down, would be 2 years ago next month when the pandemic hit, when COVID was here to stay and change the world upside down in many perspectives. Because the one thing that happened when COVID hit and lockdowns happened is that every company who had for years been putting off moving to the cloud suddenly raced to the cloud. Mm-hmm. They had to for operational continuity reasons. Quite simply, if they hadn't had access to that cloud computing or that elastic capacity for all of their staff, would they have been able to keep trading or to deliver the services that were required? In many cases, they wouldn't have been. But what they forgot was that very act of moving and migrating very rapidly everything to the cloud tore down many of the controls they put in place. They were no longer in control of all of their environment. They were reliant upon a supply chain. Now, unfortunately, when you're in these periods of uncertainty, the organized criminality that is now, the cybersecurity attackers, they're no respecters of civil society. And unfortunately, if you look at some of the stats from Interpol and the World Economic Forum over the past 2 years, it indicates that, certainly in the ransomware space, the increase is something like 450% increase in the past 24 months in the volume of ransomware attacks. A successful ransomware attack takes place once every 11 seconds globally. Wow. And when we look at that, we see that actually the supply chain is the area that most companies are struggling with. Why? Because it doesn't necessarily require them to be the weak point. It can be their supplier that can be the weak point. And that soft underbelly exposure of a supplier that you may not even have considered to be a risk to your environment could be the very entry route to your environment. So the key thing that we're seeing is that many organizations are now, as we return to whatever the new normal is going to be, are trying to understand, well, where is our supply chain? Can we truly map it out? Which supplier supports which system, which supports which business process? And until that level of detailed planning is understood, then many organizations are really struggling to contain that supply chain risk. And in that uncertainty and inability to contain and control that supply chain risk, the organized criminality, which has become as organized and as industrialized as the software development industry, is now being used to target the organizations, traditionally through supply chain. It can be through phishing attack, it can be through ransomware as a service, it can be through honeypotting, where people would entice somebody to go and get something that they know, I probably shouldn't be able to access that, but it's so enticing, I want to go and do so. There's a number of these different types of attack, but they all boil down generally to one root cause. Because no matter what we do in the cybersecurity profession, no matter what technology we buy, no matter what promises are made by the cybersecurity technology industry, the problem always exists between the chair and the computer.
Yeah.
The common user, the well-intentioned but often misinformed individual within a company who's looking to make things simple, to bypass a control. They might not understand what a policy or process has been put there for. They're simply trying to do their job. And the cyber criminal knows that, and they play on that. And that's why we see, unfortunately, this continued rise in such events that are impacting through supply chain security.
Wow, that's incredibly alarming. And to further bring that to life with possibly an example, only last year there was a incredibly high-profile attack on the Colonial pipeline. And for anyone that missed that, can you just offer an overview of what happened there too?
Yeah, and again, the Colonial pipeline is just the latest in one of many examples of what could be attributed to a nation-state type attack, because where organizations have recognized that the most influential place to attack is in the industrial space. And let me sort of roll this back 5 years to the days of NotPetya and WannaCry back in 2017. Now, I'm fortunate enough to have spent time with a number of companies who were impacted by those events. And they were collateral damage. The key to the collateral damage that was caused at companies like Mondelez, Reckitt Benckiser, Maersk, Merck, amongst others, was that the mainstay of the collateral damage that was caused was not in their enterprise IT systems. It was actually in their operational technology systems. And the key piece that was identified in the aftermath of WannaCry and NotPetya by the cyber criminals was the impact on an organization was always greater if you managed to undermine the confidence of the operational systems. Within the enterprise environment, if the email system isn't working, it's often joked within an organization that you'll actually get more work done because you're not playing at email triage. When an operational technology system, when a manufacturing system, when a heating, ventilation, or air conditioning system isn't working, if the building management system isn't working with an organization, the impact is instantaneous and often drastic to the fact that it stops the entire production of the company working instantaneously. The financial impact can also run into tens of millions of pounds per hour for the largest companies when their operational systems aren't working. And to the ransomware criminality fraternity, this presented a new opportunity. And we really saw this play out with the Colonial attack last year. Because it wasn't just Colonial that was hit. The Colonial pipeline, if my geography serves me right, traverses down most of the eastern seaboard of the US. It serves many major hubs in airports and logistics in seaports with an ability to carry that natural fuels. And if it's not working, as it wasn't working last year, we didn't just see an impact with Colonial, but we saw an impact of every company who relied on that Colonial pipeline providing the gas services to those areas. And this is where the ransomware attacker knows, in all likelihood, that ransom will be paid, because the pressure will be building up on the impacted company, not just internally, but from its customers through its supply chain responsibilities to say, you have to get back online, you have to get our systems back and working. And if you don't, we're just going to go elsewhere to a company that can provide it. Now, for the likes of Colonial, when it's then dealing at the critical national infrastructure level, it becomes even more important to be able to get those systems back online. And unfortunately, that then moves into the space where ransoms are being paid, where they continue to fund the criminal activity, which simply then creates that vicious cycle of more events, more attacks taking place. And that's where we've got to the situation today, as I mentioned, that there is a successful global ransomware attack once every 11 seconds.
And before you came on the podcast today, I was reading that, especially in the case of facilities, it's subcontractors that are more susceptible to cyber attacks than large company facilities because they tend to invest less in cybersecurity defense systems. Is that still the case? Is that right?
Very, very much so. All of the major cyber attacks that have been reported through history, the vast majority of them are not a direct attack on a specific company. The route in is through the smaller company who provides services but has links to that company. So if you look at Target, for example, and the Target breach that took place in 2013, that was an attack that was facilitated through a link to the HVAC systems, which were part of the facilities management systems, managed by a third or fourth party company. And this is why for the prime, understanding that fullest extent of your supply chain and not just thinking about it as a one-off purchase, whenever you sign the contract, okay, what are you going to be doing for me? Have you got the policies or controls in place? The key piece now is to actually say, well, how long are you going to be managing this for me? Is it a week? Is it a year? Is it a decade potentially? And actually saying, well, how often do I need to continue and continuously check and give myself confidence that you're managing those environments? And what we're seeing many of the larger companies do is actually recognize this and therefore extend the work that they do with their employees around security training and awareness, and extend that through to their key suppliers as if they're part of their organization. That societal benefit, that societal cascade down through the supply chain to ensure that the suppliers, the second, third, and fourth parties don't become that soft underbelly to expose that prime organization to the cyber risk.
And I also read there's a lack of sufficient workforce of IT personnel to monitor the industry's cybersecurity, combined with this large amount of information found in electronic logging devices, or ELDs as they're better known, is ultimately to blame. Does that surprise you? And do you think that will change?
So the numbers are globally startling. I think the last estimate, there were 5 million vacancies globally in the world of cybersecurity. For any kids, just finishing school, who are listening and thinking about career choices, there has been 0% unemployment in cybersecurity for 12 years now. It might not be a bad career choice if you're thinking about what you want to do in the future. Let's look at some of the reasons why there's gaps. And maybe let's focus in on the US as a specific example. Within the US, the mainstay of organizations' provision of IT services in the late 80s, 90s, and certainly 2000s and 2010s was to look to deliver those services for as little as possible. So the world of the Indian outsource community came on. Now, the American system relied on the provision of the H-1B visa scheme to allow organizations to bring in from outside skilled labor at low cost. And that plugged the gap. It allowed organizations in the US to massively reduce their costs. The knock-on impact of that is that people stopped going to university and through colleges attending STEM subjects. So they weren't doing science, technology, engineering, and maths. Roll it forward to 2018, I think 2019, maybe 2020. And Donald Trump revoked the H-1B visa scheme. Now, the impact of that was actually quite critical to what we're seeing in the US today. Because overnight, US organizations lost access to their happy recruiting and hunting ground for talent because they weren't able to go to India or to Southeast Asia and say, you've got a massive influx of people with the talents we need, so we're going to bring them in at a lower cost than it would cost us to employ people in the US. That has since rapidly driven salary inflation significantly in the US market, where the latest stats I have is at least a 20% per annum salary inflation is now evident. And what's going to take place is because for the past 20 to 25 years, the US economy has relied on external provision of IT resources in the main, and people haven't been going and doing those subjects at university and therefore don't have the skills qualifications. It's going to take a significant impact and effort to upskill the required number of resources. It will take at least 10, if not 15 years to build that skilled community back up to the level. And what we're going to see in the meantime is that salary inflation is going to continue. And as organizations recognize that the world has digitally transformed, many organizations are going through their blockbusters moment, where for those who aren't aware, Blockbusters was offered the opportunity to buy Netflix many years ago. Mm-hmm. It decided not to. It didn't reckon it would catch on. Well, we know who's around today and we know who's not around today. Netflix has gone on to be that digital success, and Blockbusters doesn't exist. And in the world of digital transformation, we're seeing that almost every organization is facing that challenge. How does it become more digitally relevant? How does it migrate what it does to a digital ecosystem? And where does it find the talent to do so? That's a dilemma, Neil, that many organizations globally are facing. And given the skills gap that exists, where simply we haven't been teaching the next generations sufficiently and encouraging them sufficiently to have the right skills as they've gone through school, then we are going to be left for a long period of time, unfortunately, with the skills shortage. It's great for people like myself in the industry who are providing these services to clients, but for those smaller companies who aren't able to win the war for talent, they are left in a position where they are having to carry more risk because they're simply not able to access the talent resources that they need to maintain the status quo.
You made a great point at the very beginning of your answer there about if there's any kids or students listening, maybe they should consider a career in cyber. And I was doing a bit of work for an Australian and a New Zealand-based company, and they were saying that over there, they've got something like, I think it was 3 million unfilled cybersecurity roles across APAC. And as a result, because they couldn't turn to the international community either because the borders had come up because of COVID, I think contract rates were going at something like $2,000 a day. There's just such a huge shortage, isn't there?
It's unfortunately the simple laws of economics.
Yeah.
When we have so much pent-up demand and we have such shortage of supply, then it is a candidate's market, it's a contractor's market. And unfortunately, those who can afford to pay the highest bid will always come out on top.
And with that in mind, do you think smaller businesses are more at risk than larger businesses who can't afford access to that kind of market?
It depends on their approach.
Yeah.
And this is where I often say to people who ask me this question, how can we avoid being hacked? Well, quite simply, you can't. In many respects, there is no such thing as cybersecurity. I prefer the term cyber resilience, because achieving 100% security of 100% of data 100% of the time is a nirvana that simply either is impossible to achieve or would require a bank balance the size of the US checkbook of Fort Knox, and I don't think many have access to that. So the key is to consider and the analogy is often how quick do you need to be when you're being chased by a bear? You need to be the second slowest, because then the person behind you is going to get caught. And the way you can do that within cybersecurity is to look at what are the 80% controls. What's the 80% of things that are non-negotiables that are actually quite simple to do? And good examples would be vast majority of organizations today, no matter what size they are, will use Office 365 as their email and office productivity solution. And they'll be using that online. But when they're buying that from Microsoft, the most simple thing they can do is switch on multi-factor authentication that says, well, it's not just about having a user ID and a password. It's about having a secondary device that says, when you try and log in, I'm going to actually confirm it's you by another method before I give you access. And simple controls like that allow you to achieve that 80% perspective, often at very little cost or very little additional cost on top of what you're already doing, then allow you to focus on, well, what are the things I have to do over and above? The things that, if I'm going to differentially invest in talent to protect, then rather than buying the latest shiny thing that's presented by the technology industry, to say, I can target my investment. I've done the 80%. I've moved myself to, I'm now not the slowest person on the pitch being chased by the bear. But I can get ahead. I can protect what I need to protect. And I can do risk management to really move myself forward. The great news is for organizations who are listening to this podcast, if they do this right, the world of digital is such that cybersecurity and cyber resilience is not just a tick box exercise. Do it right, it can actually be a true enabler to your business. It will give customers the confidence that you're a brand that they should do business with, that you have that evidential license to operate, that you're a trusted partner within that supply chain ecosystem. When you're bidding for work, that you can prove to that end client that you're not going to cause them problems in the future. And that cybersecurity can make business sense and be that true strategic enabler to an organization.
And I'm conscious we've highlighted a lot of problems today, and there's a bit of hope there as well. If we look at everything that we've covered today in this podcast, what do you think the answer is to improving the situation? Is there anything else you can add on that?
I suppose the key thing is I always say take a step back and consider why you're doing things. All too often, I've seen many organizations waste money on cybersecurity because they haven't truly considered why they're buying a service, what it's being implemented to achieve, or indeed why it's necessary in the first place. So the key for me is, the very simple first step is understand why you need security. What are the areas, what are the crown jewels within your business that you have to protect? Invest in those. Focus your investment on the things that will damage your brand if you don't protect them. And then make conscious choices. There is lots of great advice out there. BSI, we publish international standards, and international standards are often seen as the lowest form of consulting because it's a published book. You can buy it, you can read it, and it will tell you the answers of what you need to do within an organization. And that interpretation of that standard allows an organization to say, okay, I understand what that 80% control is. So for me, the key is take that step back, understand your start point, and take things in bite-sized chunks to actually understand why you're doing it and the purpose and the objectives you're looking to achieve.
And if we do just that, if we take that step back and look at that in the entire landscape there, what makes you hopeful about the future?
Probably the key piece for me, and this is actually quite a seismic shift, is the World Economic Forum, who meet in Davos every year. For the first time since I can remember, certainly in the past 10 years, cybersecurity has always been one of the top 10, may even have been one of the top 5 global risks within the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report. For the first time in 10 plus years this year, it wasn't one of the top 10.
Oh.
Because it's transitioned. It's now the failure of digital society is in the top 10 risks. Indeed, there's an entire chapter linked to the digital ecosystem and the failure of digital society. So the message for hope is that actually the world has recognized that cybersecurity is critical, not just as a technology perspective, not just as a tick box compliance exercise, but something which actually is systemic and critical to the success of the global economy. If that's not hope for the future, especially for people within the industry or considering the industry, then I really don't know what is, because that to me moves us to a perspective and a discussion that we've simply never been brought to the table of before.
I think that's a beautiful moment to end on. But before we do, we began the podcast talking about your origin story, that BBC computer, but now we've come full circle. I want to ask you if there was a song, movie or book or anything that has inspired or helped you in your career. I'd ask you to share that and package it into a nice story for us. And we'll leave everyone on an inspirational note. Is there anything that springs to mind though?
So my favourite film of all time is The Shawshank Redemption.
Love it.
And the reason that really sticks with me is the time and the story through time that we saw Andy Dufresne live.
Yeah.
Wrongly imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. But then, channeled himself into saying, well, I'm here. How do I get myself out of this? He persevered. He suffered. And there's many parallels to the cybersecurity industry where we've been dumbed down for years as tick box compliance auditors who, were the people who like to say no about what we can do with technology. But in the end, he found his freedom. He found his place in society, and he righted many wrongs that took place. And for me, that sort of adage of never give up. Always persevere. Always, know that you're on the right track. Be willing to get a few things wrong in time. I think everybody, if they took enough time to consider their life, will always recognize they've made mistakes and can move on from them. But by taking that time, by persevering and moving forward and continuing to press forward, you will get there in the end.
Wow, love it. Absolutely love it. I'll get that added on our Amazon list for anyone out there. I mean, maybe a younger listener that has not seen the film. I'm sure most people have. It's a great movie. But before I let you go, for anyone wanting to find out more information about BSI, any topic we covered today, or contact your team, what's the best way of doing that?
So I am quite mobile on Twitter. At Mark of Security is my Twitter handle. On LinkedIn, also Mark of Security is the handle that I use there. And online, if you Google BSI Digital Trust, then that will take you to our global website where you can find the services that we provide.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the podcast today, talking about cyber attacks against the supply chain, how they've skyrocketed, shared some breathtaking and quite alarming stats, but also left us on a very hopeful and inspirational note there. So thanks for joining me today.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Neil.
Wow, we covered so much there, and I cannot thank Mark enough for sharing his insights and why members of the global supply chain just cannot rely on big corporations to be the sole defenders of cybersecurity now. And yes, smaller companies and subcontractors remain vulnerable to cyber attacks, creating the potential for major disruptions to the supply chain, even if a large company is not the sole target of the attack. And that was the big takeaway for me. Especially due to the different software systems controlling each of the modalities' functions, companies in every single sector of the supply chain must provide cybersecurity defense that will protect each of their industries' individual systems. Makes perfect sense when we sit down and talk about it, but these are the things that are often missed. But if this is your area of expertise, if you've got any insights to share on anything we talked about today, please email me directly, techblogwriter@outlook.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram at Neil C. Hughes. I also invite you to check out my website, techblogwriter.co.uk, where you can work with me. And also remember, we're heading towards 2,000 interviews and 2 million downloads. So please leave a rating and review. If you do that, send me a screenshot and I'll give you a shout out on the next episode. But that's it. We're out of time for today. So a huge thank you to Mark Brown, and even bigger thank you to each and every one of you for choosing to tune into this podcast every single day. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.